Your child knows right from wrong. You made sure of it. And somehow, that's not enough. And you've been trying to figure out why for years. Maybe they still come home for Christmas. Maybe they're polite, even kind. But somewhere in the conversation, you say something that used to land. Something about faith, or sacrifice, or what a family owes its members. And you watch their face, and there's nothing there. Not disagreement, not argument, just a kind of blankness, like you said it in a language they can't quite hear anymore. And the thing that scares you isn't the disagreement you can see. It's the absence you can't explain. You didn't fail to teach them the values, you taught them. What you couldn't name, what nobody gave you the words for, is that something upstream of the values was removed first. Before the beliefs were even questioned, a capacity was quietly taken away. A capacity Edmund Burke named in 1790 that history confirmed in blood 3 years later, and that almost nobody in your world is talking about. This video is going to name what was removed, show you how it's formed, and give you the one action still within reach. Not to win an argument, but to tend the mechanism itself. Before we get to the concept, you need to know something about the man, because it changes everything about how you receive what he wrote. Edmund Burke was not an English aristocrat defending his own position. He was Irish. His mother and wife were Catholic in a country where Catholics were legally barred from most of public life. He was elected to Parliament from Bristol, a city he barely set foot in, and he spent most of his career defending people who couldn't defend themselves, the American colonists, the Irish Catholics, the subjects of British India. He was a Whig, not a Tory. If you'd told him he would become the founding father of Anglo-American conservatism, he would have been genuinely puzzled by the label. What made Burke conservative wasn't a class interest. It was the experience of knowing from the outside what it meant to belong to a formation, a people, a faith, a set of practices that the dominant culture of abstract reason didn't respect. He understood instinctively what it cost when those formations were dismissed as superstition, sentiment, or irrational habit. He'd seen it happen to people he loved. So when the French Revolution arrived, claiming to liberate humanity from exactly those formations, from the church, the guild, the inherited custom, Burke wasn't reacting out of aristocratic comfort. He was reacting out of something he'd learned the hard way, that the formations dismissed as irrational are often the only things keeping people human. He wrote Reflections on the Revolution in France in 1790, not as a politician defending the status quo, as someone who recognized what was being destroyed and understood what would be left when it was gone. And in the middle of that book, he used a phrase that most people who quote him have never stopped to examine. He wrote that the revolutionaries intended to tear away what he called the decent drapery of life, all the inherited forms, the rituals, the accumulated sentiments that clothe human existence in meaning. And he described those forms as coming from the wardrobe of a moral imagination, a phrase he used to mean something very specific, something that has almost nothing to do with what we usually mean by imagination. Burke wasn't talking about creativity. He wasn't talking about the capacity to dream or invent. He was describing something more like a faculty of perception, the cultivated ability to see the moral weight of persons, institutions, and inherited forms. The capacity to look at a family dinner and perceive, without being told to, that this meal carries something more than nutrition. To look at a church and perceive that this building carries something more than architecture. To look at an elderly neighbor and perceive that this person carries something more than their current usefulness. Moral imagination, in Burke's sense, is what allows a human being to respond appropriately to what is actually there. To feel the pull of obligation, the weight of loyalty, the reality of dignity in another person, rather than reducing everything to its measurable, rational function. And here is the part that matters for your children. Burke understood this capacity as something that has to be formed, not merely explained, not merely taught. Formed through long exposure to the inherited forms that carry accumulated human meaning. The liturgy that has been prayed by 1,000 generations. The family table where the same prayer is said before the same meal. The civic ritual that marks the same anniversary every year. These forms are not decorative. They are the vehicle through which moral imagination passes from one person to the next. The problem Burke saw coming in 1790, the problem he was shouting about from a position that most of his contemporaries considered alarmist, was not that the revolutionaries had the wrong values. It was that they were destroying the only institutions capable of forming the capacity that makes values real. You cannot instruct someone into moral imagination. You can only form them into it. and you can only form them into it through participation in forms that carry it. Now stop for a moment and think about what that means for how a child actually develops, not the values you taught them. The capacity that makes values land as real and binding rather than as one preference among many. Think about what you were doing when you brought your child to the same pew every Sunday, when you insisted on the family dinner, even when it was inconvenient, even when they resisted, when you observed the liturgical calendar, Advent, Lent, the feast days, not because you sat them down and explained the theology, but because the year itself had a shape, and they inhabited that shape, and their bodies and memories were formed around it. You weren't teaching, in the conventional sense. You were forming. And what was being formed in them wasn't a set of propositions to be accepted or rejected. It was a faculty, the capacity to perceive that certain things carry weight that can't be reduced to argument. And here is the mechanism at the heart of this video, stated plainly. When the little platoons that carry moral imagination, the family, the church, the neighborhood with its shared practices, weaken or disappear, the capacity itself is lost before the beliefs are even questioned, not the values first. The faculty that makes values real. The compass isn't pointing in a wrong direction. The compass was removed upstream, before the argument even started. This is why you can have a conversation with your child about what you believe and lay out the argument clearly, and find that the argument doesn't land, not because they've heard a better argument, but because the faculty that would allow the argument to land as something real and binding has been quietly attenuated. You're speaking to the head. The chest was never formed, or it's been slowly emptied. Burke never used the word curriculum. He never imagined that a government would one day claim responsibility for the formation of children's characters. But his logic points directly to the diagnosis. You cannot instruct your way into moral imagination. Instruction reaches the mind. Formation reaches the person. And only the little platoons, the small, concrete, voluntary circles of family, church, and neighborhood can do the forming because they are the only institutions capable of sustained, habituated participation in inherited forms. The school can tell a child that honesty matters. The family dinner is where the child learns what honesty costs and chooses it anyway in front of people who will remember. Burke was right about this. We know he was right because the French revolutionaries tested the opposite hypothesis and documented the results. The men who produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789 were not stupid or malicious. Many of them were among the most brilliant people in Europe. They believed, with complete sincerity, that if you gave human beings the correct abstract principles, liberty, equality, fraternity, and swept away the irrational accumulated debris of church and custom and inherited obligation, human nature would respond with flourishing. Strip away the superstition, clear the ground. Reason would do the rest. Burke read the Declaration in 1789 and predicted, in writing, what would follow. Not because he was a pessimist, because he understood that abstract principles without the moral imagination to give them human weight produce not freedom but abstraction. And that abstraction, when it encounters the resistance of actual human beings who don't conform to the theory, tends to resolve the contradiction not by revising the theory, but by eliminating the human beings. Within 3 years of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the guillotine was running. Approximately 17,000 people were officially executed during the terror. 40,000 more died in prisons and summary executions by many historical estimates. The men who ordered those deaths were not hypocrites who secretly hated liberty. They were true believers who had so thoroughly removed moral imagination from their way of seeing that individual human beings had become, to them, obstacles to the correct abstract outcome. Burke wrote Reflections in 1790 before the terror began. His prediction was not guesswork. It was the logical conclusion of his diagnosis. Remove the institutions that form moral imagination, and you will not get a freer human being. You will get a human being who can reason clearly and feel nothing. And in the hands of power, that combination is the most dangerous thing in the world. History confirmed the diagnosis. Burke didn't live to say, "I told you so," with any satisfaction. He died in 1797, watching Europe consume itself. But the argument outlasted the argument's author. Now, before we get to what can still be done, I want to point you towards something that may be the most useful confirmation of what you've just heard, because it comes from a completely different direction. In 1943, C.S. Lewis published a short book called The Abolition of Man. Lewis was not writing about Edmund Burke. He was writing about a British school textbook that, in the course of teaching students to analyze language, had quietly taught them that value statements are merely expressions of feeling, that when you say, "This is beautiful" or "This is wrong," you are not describing something real, only reporting an internal state. Lewis found this catastrophic. Not because it was philosophically crude, though it was, but because he understood what it would produce in the students who absorbed it. People who had been trained to see through every claim of value to the subjective emotion beneath, and who therefore had no stable ground for responding to anything as genuinely obligatory. He called this the problem of men without chests. In his account, a human being has a head, the rational faculty, and a gut, appetite and instinct, and between them, the chest, the trained emotional responses, the habituated reactions to what is good, true, and beautiful that allow the head to govern the gut in ways that are actually human. Without the chest, reason becomes the servant of appetite, because there is nothing else to appeal to. And here is what Lewis said about how the chest is formed. Not by instruction, by what he called stock responses, habituated emotional reactions that are trained through sustained exposure to things that genuinely deserve those responses. The child who grows up saying the same prayer before the same meal doesn't learn to reverence through a theology lesson. They learn it through 10,000 repetitions of the act of reverence, until reverence becomes part of how they perceive the world. Lewis arrived from a completely different angle at precisely Burke's diagnosis. The capacity to respond rightly to what is actually there is formed through participation in inherited forms, not through instruction in correct propositions. Remove the forms, and you do not get a person who is free to form their own values. You get a person with no chest, with no trained faculty for responding to what deserves a response. Two men, a century and a half apart, one writing about the French Revolution, one writing about a British school book. The same mechanism, named twice. If you want to take what you've just understood and actually work with it, apply it to your own dinner table, your own conversations, the legacy you're still building. There's a workbook in the description called What Your Instincts Already Knew. It was made for exactly this. 8 exercises that take you from a felt conviction to a grounded understanding you can carry into your own family. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. Here is the part that may be the hardest to hear, and also the most clarifying. You cannot re-instruct your way back to moral imagination. There is no curriculum fix. There is no YouTube video, including this one, that transfers the capacity by explaining it. Understanding the concept of moral imagination is not the same as having moral imagination, any more than understanding the concept of swimming is the same as being able to swim. This is the inversion at the heart of everything Burke argued. The very thing you reach for when you want to restore what's been lost, the argument, the explanation, the correct information, is the instrument that cannot do the job, not because it's wrong, because it's the wrong tool. Formation is not instruction, and you cannot form a person through a medium that can only instruct. What you can do is tend to the formations that remain, not as a strategy, not as a tactic for winning a cultural argument, as the thing itself, as the only mechanism through which moral imagination actually passes from one generation to the next. The family dinner is not a warm tradition. It is a political institution, in Burke's full sense of the word, an institution that forms the character a free people requires. Every time you insist on it, even when it's inconvenient, even when not everyone wants to be there, you are tending the mechanism. You are maintaining the only kind of school that can form a chest. The liturgical calendar is not a religious preference. It is a formation technology, a way of inhabiting time that makes certain things feel real and obligatory, that cannot be made to feel real and obligatory by argument. Every Advent, every Lent, every feast day you observe is a repetition that deepens the capacity to respond to what deserves a response. The neighborhood ritual, the 4th of July gathering, the Memorial Day service, the small civic observance that still happens in your town, is not nostalgia. It is the rehearsal of a shared form that carries civic moral imagination, the sense that these people, in this place, are bound by something real. Burke never saw a smartphone. He never imagined a world in which a child could spend 12 hours a day inside a medium that is, by design, incapable of forming them, that can instruct endlessly but cannot, by its nature, create the sustained habituated participation in inherited forms through which moral imagination passes. But the mechanism he described is the same one at work here. The algorithm is not evil. It is simply the wrong tool. It can inform, entertain, and even move. It cannot form. The Surgeon General of the United States declared in 2023 that loneliness and social isolation constitute a public health crisis of the same magnitude as smoking. Decades of declining participation in the little platoons, the family, the religious congregation, the neighborhood association have produced measurable pathology. Burke's diagnosis, confirmed in blood in 1794, confirmed again in data in 2023. Remove the institutions that form moral imagination, and you do not get freer individuals, you get isolated ones. So here is where we land. The child who knows right from wrong but doesn't seem to feel the weight of it, the young person who moves through the world without responding to what should move them, is not, in most cases, a moral failure. They are the predictable outcome of a formation failure that happened upstream, before the values were even questioned. The compass wasn't broken. It was removed. And you cannot restore a compass by explaining what compasses do. What you can do is be the formation, tend what remains, maintain the dinner table, the liturgical calendar, the small civic ritual, the neighborhood connection, not because these things are comfortable or even because they're effective in any immediate measurable sense, but because they are the only mechanisms through which what you carry can pass to another person. Burke prosecuted Warren Hastings, the Governor General of India, a man who had used the power of empire with what Burke considered catastrophic moral recklessness, for 7 years. He lost. Hastings was acquitted. The prosecution that consumed the last years of Burke's public life ended in failure by every legal measure. And yet, the arguments Burke made in that prosecution about the moral obligations of power, about the dignity of people who couldn't defend themselves in the rooms where decisions were being made about their lives, those arguments outlasted the verdict. They became part of the moral vocabulary of British imperial reform. The argument won long after the case was closed. Burke understood this. He once said, and this is something he did say in a letter late in his life, that he was working for a posterity that perhaps wouldn't understand his efforts for a very long time. He was not despairing. He was planting. Named grief can be carried. Unnamed grief just corrodes. You now have a name for what was removed. You have a mechanism for how it forms. You have the one action within reach. Be the formation. Tend the platoons. The question that remains smaller now and deeper is this: what in your specific life is the form you've been maintaining without knowing exactly why? The habit, the ritual, the gathering that felt like mere tradition but was, in Burke's precise sense, the mechanism itself. You probably already know. You've probably been doing it for years, quietly, against resistance, without the vocabulary to explain why it mattered. It mattered because of what it was forming. And what it was forming was the only thing that cannot be replaced. Tell me, what is the one practice your family or your community still maintains that you most fear won't survive you?